Note, no blue and white checked shirt. Okay, but, and I am so apologetic for this, I'm using a far slide template, and I'm not allowed to do that anymore. So, apologies. Okay, that was quite rude of you, actually. And you know, I'm sick and tired of people making fun of me being a dame. The problem is the word dame, and you'll know this from being in, you know, back in the home country, is that dames are ugly men playing women in Christmas pantomimes. And so it's not actually something that I necessarily want to be associated with. I mean, like, men get to be sirs, and it sounds so prestigious, and I get an effing dame. Anyway, I'll take it because I'm taking it for all the plant scientists in New Zealand. So, okay, so the title here, I've got Biologicals, the biggest bandwagon in town. And biologicals have been a bandwagon on a number of occasions over the years, but they're probably a true, actually they're not going to be a bandwagon. This is going to be the last bandwagon of biologicals, because bandwagons tend to suggest that you come and go and then you move on to something else. And I genuinely believe we're now at a stage where biologicals are going to become an integral part of, you know, agriculture in New Zealand. So why do we tend to call them the biggest bandwagon in town? Because if you just Google, you know, biologicals, you just get a plethora of media releases and reports and articles talking about, you know, the next, you know, biological revolution, and biologicals, you know, are it. And there are all sorts of predictions around the value of biologicals, of the biologicals industry in agriculture. And I used to think that these predictions were just ridiculous, but actually the prediction that we get to about 30 billion by 2030 is probably going to be met if you just look at what's happening overseas. So that's the crop biocontrol landscape from last year. And when you have that level of investment going into startup companies and whatever, you know that you're in an area of innovation that has really resonated well with lots of different people. The problem that we have is that people use different words, you know, so like, and it gets quite confusing. So people talk about biologicals, they talk about biostimulants, they talk about biopesticides, PGRPs, bioinoculants, biocontrol agents, stress protectors, soil conditioners. And in different countries, the definition of these different categories can be quite different. And so it just gets a little bit overwhelming. I tend to just try and put it into 3 categories and simplify it down. And basically, I say biopesticides are all of those products where you're going to make a claim that it can control a pest or a disease or a weed. So it's very much in the crop protection space, and that requires, you know, regulatory approval in all countries. The biostimulants is really anything that's of a biological nature that has the ability to either directly or indirectly stimulate plant growth or stimulate some sort of tolerance to, for example, an abiotic stress like drought or low temperature or something like that. And then biofertilizers are just the equivalent of the fertilizer category in the sense they are actually supplying nutrition. They're basically, it could be, you know, something like a seaweed extract or something, where they're not influencing the plant other than providing a source of nutrients. And they're probably the simplest ways to think about these categories. The only problem is that there are some active ingredients that can be biostimulants, but they can also be biopesticides and vice versa. And there are some biostimulant active ingredients that can also be biofertilizers. And that's where it gets quite complicated, because if you take a product out to the market as a biostimulant, you don't have to have, for example, in New Zealand, ACVM registration. If you take it out as a biopesticide and make a claim, then you do have to register it. And what happens is that a lot of small companies who can't necessarily cover the cost of registration will often take their products out as biostimulants to begin with. And then they have to be very careful that in all of their marketing material, they're not suggesting that there is any pesticidal activity. And certainly early on in New Zealand, a lot of biological companies didn't get that right. And they were going out as biostimulants, but in their marketing, they were sort of claiming control of some pests and diseases. And obviously, the regulatory agencies pulled them into line. The problem is that in some other countries, they're now implementing rules where if an active ingredient is registered as a biopesticide, the same active ingredient can't then be sold as a biostimulant. So they've made the judgment that if you show that this particular species of microorganism is pesticidal, then any strain of that species has to be in the pesticidal space. There's actually a fundamental flaw with that, because we know that biopesticidal activity is often strain specific. So you can actually have the same species of microbe with one strain having pesticidal activity and another not. And so the regulatory agencies around the world are having to try and grapple with this level of complexity that you don't necessarily get in the traditional ag chem space. Okay, so when we're talking about these, it can be microorganisms and it can be living microorganisms, but there are products out there where there is the microorganism in the product, but they've killed it. So it's a dead microorganism. And there are a lot of benefits if the active component of the microorganism is a metabolite that's been released, for example, during fermentation. You might want to keep it in the biological category, but kill the microbe because the activity is in the supernatant, and it makes it a lot easier to then get it registered because it's not a living organism. You don't have to do the same kind of tox, and it's not regarded as a new organism. So the amount of games being played, in the biological space, it's quite creative how people are managing to take products to market in this category. It can also be plant extracts, or it can be natural biologicals. And so again, how you use those products, depending on whether, if it's a natural biological, you would probably use it exactly the same as you would use a traditional ag chem. If it's a plant extract, it's often a multitude of compounds making up that extract. And then the challenge there is quality control. Like when you do that extraction, how can you make sure that you have enough of the active compounds in that crude extract? So plant extracts can be challenging. And then obviously the microbe space, a living microbe. Imagine you're trying to take a product that is a living microbe and you're trying to put it onto a plant, which is a living microbe, to control a pest or disease, which is a living microbe, in an environment full of living microbes. It's a bit of a challenge, and it always amazes me that we actually get some products that work, because, the environment is it's incredibly dynamic, and therefore trying to get consistency of control with a living microbe is actually a huge challenge. And that's probably one of the reasons when I started doing work on biologicals way back in the late 80s, when in fact there was only about 3 people in New Zealand that were doing work in this space. And we got a little bit of funding from the government, and we got, the growers were not remotely interested. Complete waste of time. They said it'll never work. Chemicals are the way to go. And the big chemical companies looked at it and said, nah, it's not going to really be in our space. So you had this like little blip in the late 80s, early 90s, where we had a little bit of a foray into biologicals. And then, you know, fast forward 10 years, every man and his dog was in biologicals, and the big companies jumped in, and you had a whole load of investment in that space. But the problem was that we overpromised and underdelivered. And the products that were coming onto the market, say in the early 2000s, they were not very cost effective, and they were very inconsistent in their performance, and they didn't give a good return on investment for the large ag chem companies who had jumped into that space, and so they jumped back out. And so that was sort of a little blip, but there was enough biological companies, you know, small startups and medium-sized companies that had invested enough in it, were getting enough of a positive response that they stayed in there, and they became experts in that field, and they started bringing products to the market that actually could deliver some good performance and benefits. And fast forward another 10 years to the 2020s, and the big guys now have jumped back in. And as soon as the big guys jump in and stay there, then you know you're past the bandwagon stage and you're actually into almost, you know, sort of the new innovation space. And that's where we are now. So biologicals are here to stay. And I would absolutely put money on the table that, you know, fast forward 10 years' time, and everybody in New Zealand agriculture will be integrating biologicals into their system in one way or other. And the reason is, and whether you agree with it or not, the consumers have a negative perception about synthetic chemicals, and they love the idea of natural products. The science underpinning it, you know, I mean, is questionable, but the reality is that's what the consumer likes. We also know from the talks that we've had yesterday, you know, that ag chem availability and ag chem resistance issues and the regulations that we have globally mean that it's going to be very difficult to bring new ag chems, you know, to market, and particularly in New Zealand with the small market size and the cost of regulation. And obviously with climate change, you know, we're going to have to be more adaptable. That, you know, the sort of just using synthetic chemistry, we're going to have to develop integrated packages for crop protection in particular. And therefore biologicals are going to have a part to play. So if you look at a lot of the very well-known sort of small biological companies like Marone Bioinnovations, which I worked with in the US, and Coppert and Bioworks and Isogro and Stockton, in most cases, they've either developed a joint venture with one of the big companies or they've been taken over by those big companies. And as soon as that happens, you know that the big companies are in there to stay. And when you start noticing the big companies having their own biologicals business unit, then you know that, I mean, they're not going to invest in establishing a whole new business unit if they don't feel that there is long-term enduring impact. And so my view is that we're at the start of the enduring side of biologicals. And if you look at New Zealand, I mean, there are actually quite a few, there are some biologicals that are registered as biopesticides in New Zealand. And some of these have been registered for many, many years, mainly in high-value horticulture. And so one of the problems that we have is that there might be, 5 or 6 products all, with a claim for botrytis on grapes or, botrytis on kiwi fruit. And so we've overcrowded the market, with biologicals for one particular function. And then we don't have any biologicals for 101 other functions. And that's because at the end of the day, when people do the business case, they would do a business case, say, for arable crops, and in New Zealand, it wouldn't stack up. They just would not, sort of necessarily be making the kind of margins that they want. Whereas when they do it for something like a high value sort of perennial fruit crop, it does. So, we have all of these botryticides around, and the Sentinel one is one that my research team developed in collaboration with Agrim Technologies way back, 10, 15 years ago. So we've got them. The problem is, when you look at the numbers, we are just completely behind the ball game. And we will be even more behind the ball game every year for a period of time. So, we have about 35 registered products, but a lot of them, as I said, are for the same problem, or they have the same active ingredient. So the breadth of diversity in our products is very limited. If you look at the USA, they've got 1,500 registered biopesticides. Now, you would expect that they would have a large number because that's where the vast majority of product development started back in the late 80s, early 90s, and they have a lot of investment and funding going into that space. So they're going to be able to get their products, out because they will have done all of the R&D, in the US, and anything that's a living microorganism would be indigenous to the US, and therefore you don't necessarily have to jump through the new organism hoop. So yes, Brazil is a classic example where they had almost no biologicals about 10 years ago. We were actually ahead of them, but the government decided that they wanted to position agriculture in Brazil as the most sustainable, the most sort of environmentally friendly. They wanted to position themselves against a lot of the other big countries. And they basically, the government just said, we are going to invest in biologicals, not just the production of biologicals, but the adoption and uptake of biologicals. And so they basically just created a whole process over a period of sort of 5 to 10 years where they were just going to push biologicals into the agricultural system and create a point of differentiation with their produce when they were exporting it overseas. And it's been incredibly effective. So we are absolutely behind the ballpark. And we're behind the ballpark in just getting access to biological products that are out on the market and being sold and available to growers, worldwide. And there are a whole range of biopesticides that would be great to get access to. There's a whole load of nitrogen-fixing microbe products. There's a whole load of phosphate solubilizing products. And interestingly, a lot of the companies now are coming up with product combos. So it might be a seed treatment that has a fungicide, as in a synthetic fungicide, and it might have some sort of plant growth promoting microbe on it, and it might have a bioinsecticide. And so they've basically got this combo, and when you buy the seed, you have to take everything, which is a really neat way of seed companies being able to increase the price of the seed, because you basically are forced to pay for potentially 3 or 4 products on that seed, and you might only have one problem in your paddock. These seed companies are wonderful. Okay, now the other thing that you have to be aware of is that there are a whole load of new bio-innovations coming along. So, I mean, the classic biopesticides and biostimulants, they're just the first cab off the rank. The innovation going on overseas with RNAi, I mean, is really impressive. There's a whole load of pesticide-based protein products being developed by startup companies, and that's actually the area that is getting the greatest amount of investment at the moment. And that's where we're going to start seeing products coming through with very specific claims where, rather than being, oh, this will generally, sort of suppress soil-borne diseases, there'll be specific claims where if you use this, it will control this disease on this crop, just by the nature of the discovery platforms that have been developed. But then you've got things like photocatalysts, which is almost like a new category of innovation in the biological space. So it's really important for New Zealand to keep their eye on all of these innovations, because we're going to fall behind, if we're not aware of what's out there and make an attempt to be able to get these products into New Zealand. So why does New Zealand have so few biologicals? And there are many reasons, and I haven't put these in any specific order, but when you think about the investment that's available in the US versus what we have, we have a tiny amount of investment going into biologicals in New Zealand. When I was in California, I just worked in Davis, California, and in Davis, which is a little university town, a bit like Lincoln, there was 80 startup companies all working on developing biologicals. And each of those startups would have a minimum of $10 to $20 million worth of investment. So, they're here and we're here. So the reality of us driving our own internal biologicals innovation pathway is very small. We are going to rely on those products that have been developed overseas. The problem is, and I was an IP scout for Marone, and the thing that my job was to go out and look for, sort of products. And when you do that, the vast majority of those companies are not remotely interested in New Zealand as a market. It's too small. So they want to get to the US first, and actually they want to get to South America second, and then Europe. And then they might go to Southeast Asia, and they might go to Australia. And if they've got a bit of time left, they might come to New Zealand. So market size will always be a challenge for us. I'll put in their regulatory constraints. I have to be very careful because I'm now on the board of the EPA, and so I can't say anything negative about the EPA. I can only be positive and say that change is coming. Cost and complexity. So some of the early products, you had to apply them in a specific way, and you had to store them in a particular way. And the growers would say, oh, I just can't be bothered, let's just get the chemical and throw it on, it's easy. But now with good formulations, good stability, the vast majority of biologicals can be applied in a very simple, straightforward way by growers. You don't need to sort of hold one hand behind your back and twist your neck and, plant by the light of the silvery moon. The other issue is that for New Zealand, we have not had a burning platform up until probably the last 4 or 5 years, where, in some other countries, the chemicals were just not performing. And so there was a real demand for the biologicals because they had nothing to use. Our growers have been relatively well serviced by a lot of really good products that have sort of stayed the test of time. It's really only in the last 4 or 5 years that we've had the resistance problems building up, and the growers are now saying we need something else, and so they're more receptive to biologicals. So New Zealand has got a number of challenges. The regulatory constraints, the point I will make is that, we do have to protect our natural environment, and we do have a unique environment, and therefore, whilst we can use international data packages, the legislation does say that we have to make sure those products, are not new organisms to New Zealand, and that we do understand if we put them out there what impact they'll have. And we do, under our Treaty of Waitangi, consultation with iwi, we do have to understand how they might impact on New Zealand's native flora and fauna. And that does then mean that there's extra work that needs to be done. And that will be all I will say on that. So, from FAR's point of view, FAR over here, not me anymore, how can FAR support the use of biologicals in arable systems? Well, the thing that we did about 5 years ago was we tried to raise growers' awareness about what they were and how they worked, because in many cases, most growers didn't understand. So FAR did do a lot of education and awareness, and we have been conducting independent trials looking at efficacy, and we have been demonstrating how to use them and trying to demonstrate the value proposition. And Joe Drummond has just excelled in that area through our relationship with the lighter touch. So, FAR's job is to just try and make sure that whatever products are available, that we can make them available to growers and that we can show growers how best to utilize them. So we are looking at biofungicides and biostimulants for wheat, barley and peas at the moment. There is a program looking at microbial endophytes in wheat, and we're working with Midlands and Ag Research on a bioinsecticide for grass grub, and we've been looking at some nitrogen-fixing products on a range of arable crops. So that's what our contribution to this space will be, and we're sharing all of that with all of the other plant sectors, and they're sharing their results with us so that we can try and get as many products as possible out to our growers. Thank you.